I'm beginning to understand that it's okay to be a paradox. And when I say that, I really just mean it in the context that it's okay to identify with two ideas that may be contrasting and paradoxical given different situations. And this thought really came about because I was thinking a lot about who I want to be as a person and who my own ideal self is. And I realized that although I may identify with one quality sometimes, there may be other instances where I may identify with a different quality. And I think that's perfectly okay. I think that almost, even though it's possible, I think that it's a bit limiting to see yourself as just one thing, as just one quality. And, you know, obviously to an extent, because I think that there are some things that you can be wholeheartedly without necessarily needing to be the polar opposite of that thing as well. But when I say that, I really just mean in the context that, you know, depending on the situation, it's possible to be two things at the same time, and I think that's fine. I think that so often we see on, social media and just the things that we see all around us that there are people that we may see on these platforms and even in our day-to-day lives that seem to fit a singular aesthetic in a sense and a singular vibe in a way. And I think that a lot of times we can aspire to be like that, but I think that's very limiting to do as a human being. I think that being present is also opening yourself up to new opportunities for growth, and growth can't happen without change. Nothing changes if nothing changes. So I think it's very possible that while you're on the journey of life and while you're being present in the moment, that you end up identifying with two different ideas that may be contrasting depending on the situation. And I think one of the best examples I could come up with is just in terms of, setting your goals and trying to achieve your goals in the first place. And when I say that, I mean in the context that I think it's very possible that you could be hungry in a sense, that you desire more while still being grateful for everything that you have. And it's like those two things are almost contrasting because, it's almost like saying that you're starving while still recognizing how much food is in your stomach. So while those two things are contrasting, I think it's very possible to identify with both of them at the same time. So I think it's very limiting to think that if you are, positive, then you can't be negative, and if you are negative, then you can't be positive. I think that just the human condition is a lot more complicated than simple labels like that make it out to seem. So that's really just to say that I think almost limiting ourselves to a singular thing, it can be very limiting, and it can almost make us feel bad when we don't live up to that ideal 100% of the time. But I also think that that's not productive for ourselves, and ultimately it's like we're chasing an ideal that's unattainable, because being one thing consistently, I don't think that's very possible. I think, to an extent, I think that there can be things in our lives that are consistent, but I think it's very difficult to identify with a quality 100% of the time. Another example I could come up with is, you could identify yourself with the hard as being a hard worker, but then still being a relaxer and still wanting to relax and enjoy your time off. And it seems like those two things are paradoxical. Like, oh, if I'm a hard worker, then I should be working hard 100% of the time. But it's almost in the sense that resting is a part of work and resting is a part of rejuvenation so that you could do the best of your ability. So I just think it's very limiting that we try to identify as a singular quality and almost try to shun the other, the polar opposite of that quality as well. But I think that those two things can exist at the same time, and that ultimately, that contrast and that juxtaposition of those two qualities can ultimately provide a lot of balance to our lives. And this goes into something else that I was thinking about a bit, but I also am starting to understand that there's a balance of balance and imbalance. And no, even the way I wrote it, I said that balance and imbalance are in balance. And when I say that, I mean in the sense that I think that there are periods in our lives where things should be balanced, but then there are other periods in our lives where things shouldn't be balanced so that we can get back to a point of balance. But even that by itself is kind of a bit paradoxical, because that's to say that being balanced and then being imbalanced, that's a cycle that's in balance. So when I say that, I just really mean to say that I think the human condition is a lot more nuanced than just, simple labels and almost how we make it out to seem. Not to say that it necessarily has to be complicated, but in the sense that I think that we need to open ourselves up more to more possibilities than what we originally thought was possible. I think that it's not a choice between A and B, but it could be A and B, or it could be C, if that makes sense. So yeah, this I was really just thinking about this because I was thinking a lot about who my ideal self is and almost how that person interacts with other people and how that person kind of goes about himself in the world. And I realized that there are certain things that I desire in my life, and there's certain things that I want to have in my life that almost contrast exactly who I want to be. But as I was thinking about it, I realized that that contrast and those two things could both exist at the same time. You could be one thing one way and then be another thing another way. It's like how just because you speak to your friends some way does not mean that you speak to, your elders and people that you respect the same way. But both of those are still aspects of who you are. So I think that it's important that we take that perspective and we apply it to a lot of the things that we do in our daily lives, to an extent, because that's not to say that, you should try to be like a kind person, but then also identify with being unkind. Or at least I don't think that's something that we should try to do. I think that's important that we almost posit the positivity that we want all the time. But it's to say that I think it's important to accept the fact that we may not be something 100% of the time. But in not being that thing 100% of the time, it then fuels our ability to be that thing as often as possible, which ultimately aids in us being it 100% of the time. All that to say, I understand that this is a bit of like a conceptual and like theoretical concept that I'm talking about, but it's just something that I'm beginning to understand. The best, like I said earlier, the best quote I could really come up with to explain this is that balance and imbalance are in balance. So I just think that it's important that we take that in our day-to-day lives and almost we recognize that at different points we may be in a different cycle, but that all contributes to the overall cycle of who we are as people. I have a Bible verse that goes with the topic of this video a bit. It's taken from Psalms 139 verse 14, and it says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So that's really just to say that I think that we as people are unique, and it's a bit limiting to think of ourselves as a singular label and almost not identify with anything that may be contrasting specific situations to that one thing. So really, it's just about being conscientious of what we're doing and how we're acting and almost how we're existing, and recognizing if you're swaying too far in one way and then dialing yourself back and then beginning to go another way a little bit. Yeah, that's really all I had to say for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you took something from this. And yeah, have a good night.